Because for the Vikings, hunger was never a sudden enemy. It was a shadow. Always present. Always waiting. In the frozen north, food did not simply run out. It failed. It rotted. It betrayed. It vanished under snow, ice, and darkness that lasted longer than hope. And yet somehow these people endured. Not for days. Not for weeks. But for entire winters that swallowed the sun itself. This is not a story about recipes. This is a story about survival under pressure so relentless it reshaped human behavior. A story about choices made long before hunger arrived. A story about how the Vikings learned to defeat time itself without salt, without machines, without mercy. Imagine standing at the edge of the North Sea as cold wind slices through your clothing like a blade. Your fingers are numb. Your breath burns. Behind you, your village prepares for winter. Ahead of you, the ocean offers fish but only briefly. Because once the sea freezes and storms arrive, there will be no second chance. What you catch now must last then. This was the central terror of Viking life, not battle, not raids, not death by sword but the slow, quiet threat of starvation. A threat that did not scream. A threat that waited patiently, counting days, watching stores shrink, waiting for a mistake. And mistakes were fatal. Food preservation, to the Viking mind, was not a skill. It was not a craft. It was a form of foresight bordering on prophecy. Every cut of meat, every fish pulled from icy waters, carried a question heavier than any weapon: will this still be here when we need it most? The Vikings lived in a world where the land gave generously for a short time and then took everything back. Summer was frantic. Autumn was tense. Winter was judgment. There were no markets to save them. No imports. No second harvest. Once the snow came, whatever remained was all there would ever be. And salt, so common today, was rare, expensive, and often unavailable. Many Viking communities simply did not have enough of it to rely on. Which raises a disturbing question. How did they survive at all? The answer is unsettling, because it reveals a mindset modern humans have almost completely lost. The Vikings did not fight nature. They listened to it. They watched how cold slowed decay. How wind stole moisture. How smoke changed flesh. How time itself could be bent if you understood its rules. They learned that rot was not always the enemy. That decay, when controlled, could become preservation. That death, delayed carefully, could become life. This knowledge did not come from books. It came from loss. From winters when children went silent. From seasons when the weak disappeared first. From generations who learned brutally that guessing wrong meant extinction. So when we talk about Viking food lasting years, understand what that truly means. It means trust. It means planning so far ahead that the reward would only arrive when everything else had failed. It means eating today with tomorrow already gone. In Viking culture, preservation was a silent promise made in summer and redeemed in winter. Every preserved fish was a memory of sunlight. Every smoked cut of meat was stored warmth. These foods were not just calories, they were insurance against despair. And yet, there is something darker beneath this mastery. Because preservation required patience, and patience required restraint. Not eating when you were hungry. Not celebrating abundance too freely. Saying no to yourself so your future self might live. That kind of discipline changes people. It creates a culture that respects endurance over comfort. A culture that values long thinking over short pleasure. A culture capable of crossing oceans with dried fish and hardened meat as their only companions, trusting that what they prepared months ago would still keep them alive far from home. This is where the Viking legend truly begins, not with swords, but with storage. Before the long ships. Before the raids. Before the sagas. Because a people who cannot preserve food cannot preserve power. And in the quiet spaces between storms and seasons, the Vikings learned something terrifyingly effective, that hunger could be delayed, cheated, even defeated if you were willing to understand the rules of the natural world better than fear itself. But understanding was only the beginning. What they did next, how they used air, smoke, cold, earth, and time itself would shape not just their survival, but their expansion across the known world. And once you truly understand how they did it, you may never look at modern comfort the same way again. Because the methods were simple. The consequences were enormous. And the cost of getting it wrong was death. The Vikings didn't begin with grand theories or careful science. They began with observation, the kind forced upon people who could not afford to be wrong. Somewhere in the distant past, long before sagas were sung, someone noticed something unsettling. Meat left in the cold wind did not rot the way meat left in still air did. Fish hung where the sea breeze never stopped seemed to harden instead of decay. Time passed and instead of stench, there was endurance. This was not discovery. It was revelation. In the Viking world, air was not empty. It was a tool. The northern winds were relentless, cutting, unforgiving. They dried skin, cracked lips, burned lungs. And yet, those same winds became the first invisible weapon against starvation. The Vikings learned that moving air stole moisture from flesh, and without moisture, decay slowed to a crawl. Bacteria did not die, but they were weakened, restrained, trapped in a body they could no longer easily consume. So the Vikings raised wooden frames near the coast, exposed to constant wind and cold. Not hidden. Not protected. Exposed deliberately. Fish were split open, cleaned with ruthless efficiency, and hung where the air could reach every fiber. There was no seasoning. No disguise. Just raw flesh facing the elements. And the elements responded. Day by day, the fish changed. It shrank. It hardened. It lost its softness, its vulnerability. What began as fresh meat slowly transformed into something else entirely, something lighter, tougher, and far more durable. This was not food meant to be enjoyed. It was food meant to survive. The Vikings did not rush this process. They could not. Too fast, and rot would set in. Too slow, and insects would claim it. The balance was delicate, unforgiving. The fish had to be caught at the right moment, cut the right way, hung at the right height, in the right season. A single mistake, wrong temperature, wrong wind, and months of effort were lost. This is why preservation was never left to chance. It became ritual. Routine. Law. Children grew up watching elders test the wind with their faces. Listening to the sound of drying flesh. Smelling the air for signs of failure. They learned that preservation was not about control but about cooperation. You could not force nature. You had to align with it. And when it worked, the result was extraordinary. Dried fish could last for years. Years. Hard as wood. Light enough to carry across oceans. Nutrient dense enough to keep warriors alive when nothing else remained. It could be soaked, boiled, chewed slowly, or eaten raw in desperation. It was not comfort food. It was promise. This single method, air drying, quietly reshaped Viking life. It allowed settlements to survive far from fertile land. It enabled voyages that lasted longer than fresh food ever could. It turned coastal villages into engines of expansion. But air alone was not enough. Because the wind could dry, but it could not protect everything. Meat, thick and dense, resisted the cold air's touch. Deep inside, moisture lingered. And moisture invited decay. The Vikings saw this too. They smelled it. They tasted the failure. And once again, loss became instruction. So they turned to fire not as destruction, but as transformation. Smoke was not heat. Smoke was control. Low fires burned slowly inside longhouses and smoke huts, filling enclosed spaces with thick, bitter air. Meat and fish were suspended above the flames, not to cook, but to absorb. Hour after hour. Day after day. The smoke crept into every surface, leaving behind invisible barriers, chemicals that insects avoided, bacteria struggled against, and time could not easily erase. The Vikings did not know the words for what was happening. They did not speak of phenols or preservation compounds. They spoke of experience. Of what lasted. Of what failed. Of what fed families when snow buried the world. Smoked meat became darker, tougher, and deeply altered. It no longer resembled the animal it came from. It became something else, something built for endurance. The flavor was strong, almost harsh, but that harshness was the sound of survival. And then there was the waiting. Preserved food was never trusted immediately. It was watched. Tested. Respected. Because Vikings knew something terrifyingly important, preservation did not mean safety. It meant possibility. And possibility still demanded vigilance. Each preserved piece was checked over time. Touched. Smelled. Sometimes tasted by the bold or the desperate. Preservation was an ongoing relationship, not a single action. And yet, despite the risk, these methods worked. Again and again. So well, in fact, that they changed the Viking relationship with fear. Hunger was still present, but it was no longer absolute. It could be planned for. Delayed. Outsmarted. But air and smoke were only the beginning. Because the Vikings would go even further into methods so disturbing, so counterintuitive, that even today they unsettle us. Methods that relied not on preventing decay, but on guiding it. And once you understand what they were willing to eat and why, you begin to understand just how far the human instinct to survive can be pushed. To modern minds, decay is failure. It is something to be erased, masked, disinfected. But the Vikings did not have the luxury of fear. When air and smoke reached their limits, they faced a choice that would define their survival: either reject decay entirely or learn to control it. They chose control. Fermentation was not born from curiosity. It was born from desperation. From the understanding that some foods, if left alone, did not simply spoil, they changed. And in that change, something dangerous could become something enduring. The Vikings noticed patterns. Meat buried in cold earth behaved differently than meat left in open air. Fish stored in sealed containers transformed in ways that did not always lead to death. Time, pressure, and cold altered the rules. The smell became sharp. The texture softened. The taste, unforgiving. And yet, those who ate it lived. This was the most unsettling truth of Viking preservation: some foods were saved not by stopping rot but by inviting the right kind of it. Fish were buried underground, packed tightly in pits where oxygen could not easily reach. The cold slowed chaos. The lack of air redirected decay. What emerged weeks or months later was no longer fresh, but it was stable. It could be eaten when nothing else remained. It was not pleasant. It was not celebrated. It was endured. Meat followed similar paths, sealed in containers. Stored beneath earth or stone. Protected from animals. Left to time. The process demanded courage, not just to prepare, but to consume. Because one mistake meant sickness. One misjudgment meant death. Fermented food was never casual. It was respected like a weapon, powerful, useful, and dangerous if mishandled. These methods shaped Viking psychology in subtle ways. A culture that eats fermented meat learns to tolerate discomfort. It learns that survival is not always sweet. That life sometimes smells wrong before it feels right. This tolerance became strength. It allowed Vikings to push boundaries others could not. But fermentation was not their final answer. Winter itself offered another solution, one so obvious it became invisible. Freezing. When the cold arrived, the world stopped moving. Rivers locked. Soil hardened. Flesh froze solid. The Vikings did not resist the stillness, they used it. Meat and fish were stored outdoors, in shaded areas, or in pits that stayed frozen for months. Nature became their keeper. But freezing was fragile. A sudden thaw could destroy everything. So the Vikings learned caution. They rationed. They checked temperatures by instinct. They never trusted warmth. Food was thawed slowly, carefully, only when needed. Waste was unacceptable. Waste meant hunger later. And then there was fat. Animal fat was more than nourishment, it was protection. Meat coated in fat, or left within its skin, was shielded from air. Moisture was trapped. Decay slowed. Combined with cold storage, this method extended life far beyond expectation. Each of these techniques, air drying, smoking, fermentation, freezing, fat sealing, was imperfect alone. Together, they formed a system. A network of contingency plans designed for a world that did not forgive mistakes. This system allowed something extraordinary to happen. The Vikings began to think long-term. Not in days. Not in weeks. But in seasons. In years. Preservation reshaped their sense of time. Food prepared in summer was eaten in darkness. Meals became memories. Every bite carried the past forward. And this long thinking changed everything. It allowed families to endure winters without panic. It allowed ships to sail farther than ever before. It allowed warriors to fight knowing starvation was not immediately behind them. Preservation did not just save lives, it created freedom. Freedom to explore. Freedom to raid. Freedom to leave home. And yet, there was a cost. Because living this way meant accepting constant tension. Every preserved store was both hope and risk. Every winter tested whether the past had been prepared correctly. The Vikings lived with delayed consequences. Success or failure was revealed slowly, mercilessly. By the time spring returned, survival itself felt like judgment passed. This is why Viking preservation was never casual. It was sacred in its own way. A quiet agreement between humans and an unforgiving land. And once you see it clearly, you realize something unsettling. The Vikings did not survive because they were stronger or braver than others. They survived because they were willing to eat what others would not. Wait longer than others could. And trust methods that demanded discipline long before reward. In the next section, we will confront the moment when preservation stopped being survival and became power. When stored food no longer just kept Vikings alive, but helped them change the course of history. At first, preserved food was nothing more than a shield. A thin barrier between life and the slow collapse of winter. But over time, quietly, almost unnoticed, that shield became something else. It became leverage. When a people no longer fear the next meal, their thoughts begin to wander beyond survival. The Vikings reached this threshold not through comfort, but through control. Their mastery over preservation gave them something rare in the ancient world: predictability. They could count their food. They could measure their winters. They could plan. This changed the rhythm of Viking life in ways no sword ever could. A household with full stores entered winter differently. Not relaxed but prepared. Decisions became calculated instead of desperate. Elders could think beyond the coming storm. Leaders could promise journeys not yet taken. Preservation turned time from an enemy into a resource. And resources create power. The longships that would one day terrify coastlines across Europe did not leave harbor on courage alone. They left because there was food on board that would not rot. Dried fish, smoked meat, hardened by wind and fire, packed tightly and trusted completely. Each piece represented weeks of safety. Each bite was permission to keep moving forward. Without preserved food, the Viking expansion collapses instantly. No raids. No exploration. No distant settlements. A ship without reliable food is a coffin that floats. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Before a voyage, food was inspected more carefully than weapons. It was weighed, counted, tested. The strongest warriors were useless if hunger weakened them. Preservation was not background labor, it was strategy. This is where preservation crossed into dominance. A Viking crew could arrive where others could not. Stay longer. Strike harder. Wait when needed. Their enemies often faced hunger first, not steel. While coastal defenders rationed fresh stores and watched them spoil, Vikings ate food prepared months, sometimes years earlier. Time fought on their side. But this advantage came with a psychological edge as well. Eating preserved food forged a mindset of endurance. Meals were not indulgent. They were functional. Every bite reinforced a lesson learned since childhood: comfort is temporary, preparation is permanent. This attitude spilled into everything. Into warfare. Into navigation. Into leadership. A people trained to delay gratification are dangerous. They do not panic easily. They do not waste. They do not expect rescue. They rely on what they carried with them. And yet, this long-term thinking carried a shadow. Because food preserved for years carries memory. Each winter meal was a reminder of the summer that had already passed. Of labor already spent. Of choices already made. If preservation failed, there was no fixing it. No apology. No second chance. This created a culture obsessed with responsibility. Mistakes were remembered. Families that failed to prepare suffered visibly. Hunger was not abstract, it had names and faces. Children learned early that survival was earned long before it was needed. That eating was an act tied to discipline, not pleasure. That the future punished carelessness without mercy. This discipline is what allowed Viking society to stretch outward without snapping. But here is the paradox. The same systems that gave Vikings power also bound them to constant vigilance. Preservation demanded endless labor. Endless checking. Endless restraint. There was no moment where one could truly relax. Even abundance was fragile. This tension between security and anxiety shaped the Viking soul. They celebrated fiercely because they knew scarcity was always returning. They valued honor because life was never guaranteed. They planned for death because survival itself was conditional. Preserved food did not make them fearless. It made them realistic. And realism is a powerful weapon. As Viking influence spread, so did their methods. Coastal settlements learned from them. Traders adopted their techniques. Their preserved food became not just sustenance, but currency traded, stored, relied upon. What began as a defense against hunger became a foundation for expansion. But every system, no matter how effective, has a breaking point. In the next section, we will confront the moment preservation failed, when nature shifted, when methods were tested beyond their limits, and when even the Vikings were forced to face the question they feared most. What happens when the future you prepared for never arrives? For all their knowledge, for all their discipline, the Vikings were never invincible. Preservation gave them control, but only as long as the world obeyed familiar rules. And sometimes, without warning, those rules changed. A winter could arrive too early. A summer could end too soon. A storm could ruin drying racks in a single night. When this happened, the danger was worse than open hunger because it came disguised as safety. Food that looked preserved could fail quietly. Fermented stores could turn hostile. Smoked meat could rot from the inside out. The Vikings feared this more than emptiness, because false security kills faster than desperation. This was the moment of reckoning. Every winter, families waited not just for spring, but for proof that their past decisions had been correct. Meals became tests. Each bite was cautious. Each illness was terrifying. Preservation failures were not blamed on bad luck, they were treated as warnings, lessons carved into memory. When stores failed, consequences rippled outward. A household weakened first. then a settlement, then an expedition cancelled. Power shrank not through battle, but through invisible loss. The Vikings responded the only way they knew how, by adapting. They diversified methods. No village relied on a single technique. If air drying failed, smoking remained. If fermentation went wrong, freezing might save the rest. Preservation became layered redundancy before the word existed. They also adapted socially. Food stores became communal in times of crisis. Not out of generosity but necessity. A starving neighbor was a liability. Hunger weakened defense. So sharing became strategy. Survival was collective or it was nothing. This is where Viking preservation reveals its most human side. Despite their fearsome reputation, these people survived not through isolation, but cooperation. Knowledge was shared. Mistakes were remembered publicly. Elders passed down not just methods, but warning stories of the year everything went wrong. These stories were as important as any technique. Because preservation was not just physical, it was cultural. Memory itself became a storage system. Lessons were preserved the same way food was, slowly, carefully, and with respect for consequences. But even with adaptation, limits remained. There were winters when nothing worked. When ice melted too soon. When rot spread faster than control. When stores vanished before daylight returned. These were the winters that reshaped bloodlines. The winters no saga romanticizes. Those who survived carried something with them into the future, not just knowledge, but humility. The Vikings never believed they had mastered nature. They believed they had learned how to negotiate with it. And negotiations can fail. This awareness created a culture that prepared obsessively, but never assumed success. A culture that celebrated survival because it knew how easily it could be lost. And this is the final truth hidden inside Viking preservation. Their strength did not come from certainty. It came from readiness to endure failure. In the next and final section, we will step back from history and confront what this ancient knowledge reveals about us, about comfort, about abundance, and about how far we have drifted from the instincts that once kept humans alive. Because the Vikings did not preserve food to live well. They preserved it to live at all.